it's funny to think you're at a tire store and, you got the guy that's like, hey, it'll be $600. And then imagine like someone from your local pizza shop walks up, hey, here's $100 of pizza for a party you're throwing. Well, you won't be able to afford the tires, but do you want to buy this pizza right now? Like, well, no, I'm not going to buy the pizza. I've got to buy these tires right now. But we do make that decision accidentally, constantly, where we're spending now and giving up the ability to handle something in the future. Envisioning that you're negotiating with this future version of yourself is pretty enlightening for people.
I want to start by saying that I've actually been a user, customer of You Need a Budget for about 8 years. I actually looked prior to this, and I'm just on my 8-year anniversary. And what happened was a little bit after my wife and I had gotten married, we saw, like anybody, right? Your money's a reflection in some ways of your values.
Yeah.
And everybody spends their money differently, right?
Yeah.
Like some people, they spend money on vacation. Some people, they spend money on coffees, on whatever it is. And we saw there was like tensions that would come about because it wasn't really clear how we want to be spending our money together as a couple. And the tool itself has actually been really, it's kind of like a vital part of our relationship.
It
did a lot for us, really, and I couldn't be more happy with it. So thank you for that. For those who may not be familiar, what is You Need a Budget? If you're just going to explain kind of the basic premise of it.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, we've built an app that helps people develop a set of habits around their money to help them, I would say, love how they spend, and or maybe even just spend without so much guilt and second guessing. And so we're coming at it very much from a money should be spent mindset, but we want to kind of remove the chore that people feel around money and kind of start to inject some imagination, some possibility. And so that's what we've been doing for about, we're in our 20th year working on this. So the world fundamentally, I think they just think about money completely wrong. And we see it as an opportunity, an opportunity to express yourself more forcefully, more accurately, more authentically, to have money do for you what you really care about. And I don't think I'll ever get tired telling people about that,
Now, was that something that philosophy around money, was that always there for you? Is that something that was instilled in your family of origin, or did you kind of have a shift of perspective at some point?
No, I mean, I've definitely developed more of this feeling of like why it's so important that your money is aligned with your values. But I grew up, middle class, where I didn't have any like existential worries about money, and that definitely gives you something in your formative years. But frugality was praised, definitely, and encouraged. And that also I've kind of pushed back against in my later years. I don't like waste, because waste is money doing something that is not aligned with your values. But sometimes people they'll kind of say, well, frugality is good for its own sake. And I don't really buy into that. I would need to ask the person a lot more questions before I just said, okay, yeah, I agree with you, that frugality is it. So, but I was raised definitely in a family where that was celebrated. You're expected to definitely spend less than you made, and all those good kind of standard things that you would hear. I think I was taught more than most good money lessons. I think I'd venture a guess there for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting because hearing you tell a little bit of your own story, I think some people are very lucky in that they have a mentor or a series of mentors who really teach them a lot about money. But for most of us, there's not really any philosophy around money that's passed down, maybe just things that we pick up on.
Yeah.
And I think I grew up where money was viewed in more of a lens of frugality as well. And even like you were saying, still to this day, there's a desire not to waste, because it's kind of like there's something about waste that just seems not only unnecessary by definition, but there's something kind of like unsightly about it, right? It almost feels like it's part of like a consumptive way of approaching the world.
Yeah, just feels, there's like almost a moral, like, oh, that is just wrong. Yeah, like, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but I remember it was funny because my dad specifically, he was one of those guys who'd use coupons a lot, right? And I remember he'd go and get these coupons, and he would go and buy things that no one actually wanted, right? So it was like, because he could save money on whatever was the thing on sale, he would go buy this thing, and then it wouldn't even necessarily be used. And that was one of the early points where I was like, I don't know, that doesn't seem to make a ton of sense. But then even later on, I started noticing that there's certain habits around money that seem to get people stuck I'd love to actually have you take a minute to walk through maybe these ways of looking at money, the decision-making framework, some of these practices you were just referring to, because for people who aren't familiar with you need a budget, with a philosophy, or maybe even these more specific items, if you could just maybe give a little bit of the basis for how you encourage people to think about it.
Yeah, so we have these 4 habits that we teach, or practices, as you said. I really like that word. It implies that it's ongoing, that you're never totally done, right? And the first one is to give every dollar a job. And what we're doing is we're acknowledging that money is finite, it is scarce, and that you want to start to look ahead and kind of say, okay, what does my money need to do for me? And it's interesting, people often haven't even thought what they want their money to do. They've just been kind of told what their money should do. And so this first bit where someone might just have, say, $300 in their bank account, we can say, well, what do you want that money to do before you're paid again? And they can make the conclusion pretty quickly, like, oh, gas, groceries, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, pay this bill. Money's all spoken for. Every dollar has a job. And they feel this contentment because they've actually taken action. They've been proactive. They aren't waiting for something to happen. They're affecting, they're acting. And that is very empowering. Then you pair that with their second practice where we're saying we want you to embrace your true expenses. And we define true expenses as those larger, less frequent expenses that are also very real, very tangible. So if someone celebrates Christmas or the holidays, we see everyone's spending spike, or you go on a summer vacation, or you pay your property taxes, or your car tires need to be replaced. These are all large, less frequent expenses. They're not a monthly cell phone bill. But what we try and do is get people to think about those car tires as if they were a monthly cell phone bill. We say, well, you're going to need to replace them, I don't know, every 4 years. And they're going to cost you $1,000 for easy math. So $250 a year, that's about $20 a month. So you now have this car tire bill that's $20 a month, and you just plug it away. The cool thing is when you pair that first habit and the second habit together, you're giving every dollar a job in the moment, but it's also like future Steven also appears at the negotiating table, and your wife also, and the future version of your wife, and all 4 of you are kind of like, hey, what do we do with this money? And the future couple is like, we need the car to be repaired. And you're like, really, when? They're like, we can't tell you exactly when, but we know it's going to happen. And so you're doing this negotiation, this trade-off of money for us now, money for us later. And you're a little more future-oriented. Your time preferences getting extended a little bit, and that improves your decision-making. The third rule is to roll with the punches. And in that sense, when we've given every dollar a job, we're embracing these true expenses. The third rule or practice is basically us saying, hey, you're going to have this great plan, and then new information is going to come. Change it as needed. So as soon as you set the plan, just know that it's going to go sideways slightly. You're more like a coach who has a fantastic game plan, studied all the film, and then when push comes to shove and the game starts, they're immediately adjusting to reality. And so this third rule is that. Our fourth rule, we call it aging your money. And it's this idea, if you follow the first 3, it almost happens automatically. But we want your money to sit and age. So money you earn today, you don't need for 20, 30, 40, 60 days. The more variable your income, the longer you should let your money sit so that you can kind of smooth out the variability. But that idea of letting your money sit, it gives you power over it. It is very empowering to realize the money you were just paid is not immediately spoken for by creditors, bills, all that stuff. So to be able to just have it in your system for 30, 40 days, really, it kind of changes the psyche for everyone. You sleep better, literally. You make better decisions. You aren't as rushed. You aren't as under the gun to react to, negative situations. So these 4 practices are really meant to improve your decision-making as it relates to spending your money. I've often likened it to, I was just at the tire store the other day and buying some new tires. And I was laughing because I thought, it's funny to think you're at a tire store and you got the guy that's like, hey, it'll be $600. And then imagine like someone from your local pizza shop walks up and is like, hey, here's $100 of pizza, for a party you're throwing. And then you're like, well, you won't be able to afford the tires, but do you want to buy this pizza right now? Like no one in their right mind would be like, well, no, I'm not going to buy the pizza. I've got to buy these tires right now. But we do make that decision accidentally, constantly, where we're spending now and giving up the ability to handle something in the future, whether it's 3 weeks down the road, 3 months down the road. Envisioning that you're negotiating with this future version of yourself is pretty enlightening for people. And again, it's just about improving the decisions. You'll notice I haven't said don't spend. We want you to spend. We just want you to spend just totally aligned with what you care about.
There is so much going through my head. I was taking some notes as you were talking, and I have them all over my page. So one thing I want to highlight right now for those who are listening is what Jesse just did is he highlighted a few practices that sounds like, okay, this is just some practices. These might be some nice things to incorporate. But I just want to highlight what I perceive is actually going on behind the curtain and why I think some of these are really, really consequential. And it goes even beyond just money. For one thing, it's like when you think about the way that we engage with money, a lot of times we engage with it almost like we're maybe a victim or we're kind of trapped in the circumstances of what's happening. We feel defeated. We actually feel kind of small. And every single human person, we want to feel big. We want to feel like we have agency.
Yes.
And so just this simple movement towards giving every dollar a job, that's a movement towards agency.
Yes.
And it's a movement towards intentionality. It's a movement towards actually saying, okay, what is it that I really want? And there's always going to be this tension between the urgent and the important. And by actually just being future focused, you're again, bring yourself back to really focus on these things that are most important, creating the space for the things that you need to so that you're not having to be in these difficult situations. So over time, there's compounding effects, which just creates more and more space, which then creates more and more of a spaciousness with oneself, which then also transforms, I think, one's relationship with money, which then flows over into your entire experience of life.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying here is that these practices really do work, and they really are very, very, very consequential. And one of the reasons I was so excited to talk to you, Jesse, is because with the Monk Manual, which is this tool that I had created that's a productivity system, it's really more than that, but it's a way for people, a system to try and help people manage their time and be more intentional with it.
Yeah.
There's just so much overlap between the two approaches.
Absolutely.
And I want to highlight that as well for people who are listening from the Monk Manual community, that these same ideas of giving every dollar a job, it's the same as the idea of trying to give every hour a job, right? Of trying to also roll with the punches and to allocate the space for the things that need to be allocated for. I want to share a personal story because this was a turning point for me in the way that I thought about money. And it's going to sound like such a simple thing, but I remember at one point I had a friend who he had been attending therapy for a certain period of time, and he had encouraged me to do the same, just saying, hey, I think this might be a good thing for you. And I kept on saying, oh yeah, I think that's good. I think that would be a good thing. But for whatever reason, I was putting it off. And eventually he actually confronted me in a sense around it. I was like, hey, you keep on saying that this would be a good thing, but why don't you want to go and do this? And I remember I told him, I was like, I don't know. I just think it's too expensive. It's like too expensive. And at the time I had health insurance through the company I was working for. So it's going to cost about $25, right? Which is actually relatively not, I look at that now and I think like, that's nothing, right? That's nothing. But at the time it actually seemed like a really big expense.
Yeah.
It felt so big to me. And what was interesting is his response was, I understand that. I kind of understand where you're coming from, but what is money for? And I remember him asking me that question of like, what is money for? And it was funny because I had never actually considered that question.
Yeah.
I truly had never actually considered the question of what is money for. I'd considered the question of how should I like save money or how should I go and like, what's the responsible thing to do in this scenario or that scenario?
Yeah.
But that was a real shift of mentality. And it's actually set me on a different trajectory because since that time, I started paying $25 an hour or whatever it was for that experience. And I've invested so much money since that time in personal development because I've just seen what it can actually do. But it came first with that question of what is money for?
Yeah.
And for people who maybe are interested in changing their approach to money, of having their money align more closely with their values, do you have any advice for someone who's just getting started on that journey about how they can maybe start to change the way they're approaching their money and think more in terms of giving their money a job, of approaching their money with a real intention behind it?
Yeah. I love that you landed on the word agency. We use it a lot internally. It's not a useful word for marketing. You can't be like, you really want to be an agent, because it just doesn't make any sense off the cuff. But agency is power. It's the ability to act to effect. And so I love that you landed on that, because that is at its core what we're trying to get people to do. So we're basically an education company that sells software to pay the bills. And I would encourage anyone just to take one of our free classes. All of our education is free, and just have them walk you through implementing these practices with our software, knowing full well you can use all kinds of different implements to actually do the practice. You don't have to use our software. The 4 rules that you would follow, they stand on their own, and they're a way of thinking. You can't sell an idea, you know? So we just sell software because we found that is an easy way to have people implement this way of thinking. But I say that because it would be a tragedy for someone to be like, I don't want to mess with software. And it's like, fine, don't mess with the software, but really mess with these rules. One thing that I would encourage people, as far as your question around just kind of how do you get started, is I actually want to springboard off of what your friend had said, what is money for? And like have people write down, and I would challenge them to write 100 things down, not 10, like write 100, literally 100. And don't do it on a computer. Write it on a piece of paper to where you're not encouraged to make it fancy or click somewhere else or whatever. Just like get a piece of paper out, write down 100 things. What are they for? And then work back through the list and circle the ones where you're like, I really like this one. I really like this one. Cross the ones off that you wrote because you felt like you should write them, you know? Like start to just kind of work the list. And what I'm trying to have someone figure out is what they really care about, what they really want. And it's funny, and we'll do this with couples too. It's really funny when you sit down with a couple and you're like, well, what do you want your money to do? And they end up having this deep relationship discussion that's not even about money. It's just like, oh gosh, what do we want in life? You know, where do we want to live? What do we want to do? And so that's what we're trying to get to. Don't talk about money at all. Start with your goals, your aspirations, just kind of dream for a little while, and then start to put a framework around it that is your money situation. But first, it's surprisingly eye-opening for people because we don't often stop. I mean, you talk about teaching people to be intentional with their time, but you have to know what you're intending, you know? Like you have to know what the objective is. And a lot of times we just think, well, I'm supposed to save money, you know? Well, I guess I think it's responsible to do this or that with money, you know, so we do it. But the why behind it is what will have the staying power. And that why is done with introspectively saying, what do I want my money to do? What is it truly for? I can tell you unequivocally, your money is for you, right? And now that's where I have to step out. And then you have to step in and say, okay, what does that mean?
How can individuals maybe balance the tension between the desires of short-term gratification versus long-term gratification?
Have them both. They're not mutually exclusive. You can totally be doing both. You can be like, here's our Christmas fund. We're throwing, I don't know, $400 a month in there to have, you know, almost $5,000 for Christmas. So you can be doing that. At the same time, you can be like, here's our Friday night party fund. Like you totally can do it. You can do a spontaneous category. You can just say like, this is for spontaneous stuff. And someone's like, well, you can't schedule spontaneous stuff. You don't know when it'll happen, you know, but you can know that it will. And that's enough to be able to say, oh, that's just kind of our spontaneous category. There's a really fun one people do in the community. I think they call it spontaneous giving, but it's basically where you see opportunities to give money to someone in some way that you can't come up with it beforehand, but there's just suddenly a moment where you're like, oh, I should help this person out. Whether it's a friend, a stranger, it doesn't matter. It's spontaneous. And so, yeah, you can plan all that in, and you really can't have it both ways, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because when I think about the journey that someone has in properly ordering the way that they want to approach money, and maybe that's not the exact right way to put it, but I think that starting point of figuring out what is it that you really want, like what is money for? That's a starting point. And then there's also a configuration process of like, how do I want to weight some of the short-term things versus the long-term things? I think there's a struggle that's maybe just like the human part, that like part of the actual tension is just the fact that we also have to say no, that there is like a finiteness.
Yeah.
Like for most people, maybe they have to say no to the yacht, right?
Yeah.
Like even if they want the yacht, they have to say no to the yacht, at least for a long period of time, right? Or maybe for something that's more accessible to most people, it might be like, okay, well, we can't maybe say yes to the vacation this summer because of whatever happened. This person lost their job, this or that. Do you have any advice for how individuals can maybe experience that in a positive way rather than just pure loss? Yeah,
we call it scarcity is clarity. And we actually try and manufacture as much scarcity as possible. So people call it YNAB broke, where by the time you've been working with us for a while, and by with us meaning using the software, you know, you probably have 6, 7, 8, 10 grand in your bank account. And you might be used to a year before having 300, 400 on average, because it goes high with the paycheck and then it just precipitously drops just because all the bills are waiting. And we've kind of turned it around, and it's like you have a pile of money waiting for bills instead of bills that are waiting for money to arrive. And so you have this situation where your bank account is as big as it's ever been. And this is just your standard checking account. And then what happens in the community is people will, a friend will say like, hey, do you want to go grab some sushi? And you think, I'll break maybe $80 or something. I don't know. And you're like, oh, I can't. I could do sandwiches. You could come to my house and we can have leftovers, but I don't have enough money in my eating out category. You're like, I'm broke. And you're not actually broke. You got 10 grand in the account, but for all intents and purposes, your eating out money is very, very, very scarce. And the way that we've given every dollar a job with Rule 1 is we're creating that scarcity in these very defined, kind of tightly scoped areas where you can easily see, I cannot afford that thing. And then share it with the friend also, like, I just can't do that tonight, but let's do something different. Scarcity is clarity, meaning you make really good decisions when all of your dollars have already been assigned. I mean, I could ask my 8-year-old daughter, hey, here's this scenario. What do you think we should do? And she would get the right answer. She's smart, but she doesn't have life experience yet. But it's that obvious when you look at your money allocated in that way, what needs to be done and what doesn't. People make great decisions when the information is presented appropriately. If we're just relying on, hey, I've got a lot in my checking account balance, it's like finger in the wind, feels pretty good, let's go. That's where people get into a lot of trouble because they're spending future money that they didn't realize they need for the car tires or for the vacation they would love to take. And so in that way, we really try and get people to feel that scarcity. Now, the cool thing about it, and maybe a little bit of a personal story, I did not want to go into debt to get through school. My wife and I got married very young, and I needed to make it through school still. She was making $11 an hour. And then our first baby was going to be born, and we really wanted her to be able to just not have to work, just focus on being a mom. Her income was going to go away. Not that it was a ton, but she was the breadwinner at the time. And I was upset that I wasn't going to be able to make it through school without borrowing money. We had been using YNAB, but at that time it was just a spreadsheet for me and Julie. There was no commercialization at all. And because my brain wouldn't entertain the idea of borrowing money, of solving the scarcity problem with debt, my brain came up with another idea, which was maybe you could just sell this little spreadsheet you've built to people and just get through school, just get by. And that was the grand entrepreneurial vision, it was like get through school, make rent. Only a year and a half later, are we building software for it, replacing the spreadsheet. A few years later, we're doing version 2, and then a web app, phone apps, the whole thing. And I remain forever grateful that I didn't entertain the debt as a solution to scarcity. You could argue the morals of debt or whatever you want, and I would happily debate someone about it. But to me, debt is robbing us of creativity. And so when you can easily just walk past zero and swipe a credit card, easily solve that problem by essentially kicking it down the road, I think we're robbing ourselves of ingenuity, of creativity. And that's the loss that you can't see it measured in any kind of GDP or, any kind of like happiness factor. But I feel like that's a loss for people just to so easily solve scarcity by borrowing to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you see that effect really commonly played out for entrepreneurs or founders who take on investment money from like a venture capital or private investment, where all of a sudden they get a ton of money and they just start burning through it because it's like it's not real.
Yes.
And because it's not real, they don't have to think like they would normally think.
Yeah.
But what ends up happening for most people is when your back's up against the wall, you start thinking really creatively.
You do.
Right?
Yeah.
You start seeing, I'm actually thinking about like that image of like the back being against the wall. It's almost like you can be stuck in a scenario where you're like, oh, there's only A and B. But then as it gets kind of closes in more and more, like you're in a back alley, all of a sudden you start seeing C, D, E, and F, because you're like, oh, maybe I could actually climb over that, or I could do this,
the
or you
brain
could
kicks
do
in.
that. Yeah, the brain kicks in because that's what it's meant to do.
Yeah.
And there's also something I think about debt that it makes money abstracted in a way that I think is not necessarily the most helpful, right? It creates this really amorphous feeling of it, and it makes you feel like you're maybe more just manipulating things, but I think it's rare that it creates a feeling of agency.
Yes.
If anything, it can feel like a real imprisoning.
Yeah.
And some people to the point where it actually is so demotivating that they feel like, I don't even know if I can actually climb out from this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's an abstraction. I like that you said that. I think debt is an abstraction for people, and that by definition is not felt the same way. It's abstract. Julie and I just moved to like not even using a credit card because we were just like, let's just use the debit card and have money just go right out of the account. And I get the whole thing. People are like, oh, the rewards, this and this. I get all that. I totally get it. Our software handles it to where it kind of makes the credit card seem like a debit card so that you can always pay it off in full and not pay interest. And I get all of that game. But at the end of the day, it's so much simpler and it is less abstracted when I swipe my debit card and money goes out the door. Versus like I swiped it and this number over here went up slightly, but my bank account stayed the same. And I think that one abstraction layer does change the decision making to the benefit of all of those that profit from the consumption that they're trying to promote. That abstraction layer, I think, has an effect, or I don't think it would be so heavily, absolutely just murderously pushed down our throats the way it is.
Yeah, it's also interesting because when you're using something that is more concrete, like let's even say it's a $20 bill, that $20 bill is a concrete entity. So when you go and you hand that over because you're getting ice cream cones for your family, it's actually fairly clear that you're simultaneously saying no to everything else that you could have done with that $20. And so on one hand, maybe there's something that could feel negative about that, but I also think like it feels like a more true yes. Like you're actually saying, of all the things I could do with this money, this is what I'm doing. And there's something even empowering just about that.
No, that is exactly right. The being able to say, I have decided and this is my decision versus I'm actually not really sure, but I'm giving up this resource anyway, but I'm not really aware that I'm giving it up. That whole mess is not nearly as clarifying and empowering as just saying, I have chosen and here it is. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. For individuals who maybe are facing, because I'm sure you have a lot of people in the community who maybe are facing substantial amounts of debt that maybe does feel a bit overwhelming, right? Or it's just like this unbeatable task to go and actually overcome this. Are there any specific recommendations you have for people in those sorts of circumstances?
I mean, as far as tactics, not really. We tell them work the rules and watch and see what happens. People, when their awareness is kind of at peak where these rules get them, they start to notice things about their spending and they start to kind of be like, oh, wait, I didn't know I was doing that. I'm going to stop. Or it's a game of would you rather. Hey, would you rather have this debt over here or do this? And they're like, I'd rather get rid of the debt. And so they start to just kind of notice things. Their awareness informs them. I mean, spoiler alert, a lot of people, when they become aware, they eat out a lot less, like materially, to where they didn't think they could get ahead. And then suddenly they just realize like, oh gosh, we're eating out. Whoa, this is 5x what we thought it was, And so they cut back on that and no loss of joy at all. And then every once in a while, there's the person that's like, no, Jesse, you don't understand. Like for me, eating out is experiential. And they talk to me all about it and how great it is. And I was like, okay, you keep doing that because this moves you, But for most people, they aren't having that experience. They're doing it for a different reason. And when they get clear on those reasons, they usually start to cut it pretty tremendously. I will say this, though, as like an overarching maybe mindset for people, we care much more about pace than position. So if you're way behind, and you got a lot of debt, what's your pace? Do you feel like you could keep up this pace? Perfect. It's the people we worry about that they don't figure out how to prevent the next debt. So they need to follow the first 4 rules and build up a little bit of like a debt prevention strategy. And that's about looking ahead to the car tires, the vacations and things like that, and saying, okay, these things used to cause me to go into debt. I'm going to prevent that from happening first. And they get that plan in place. So they might be starting to build up a little bit of cash and their debt hasn't moved at all, but they're preventing it. And that is a big deal to be able to not go backwards as you start this. So once you got that in place, rules 1, 2, and 3 are rolling pretty good, even rule 4 a little. Then what happens is you just start to attack the debt and you do it in a way that works for you. You aren't supposed to sprint. I mean, if you're like, I could be done with this in a month, okay, go sprint. But for a lot of people, you're going to be in this for a while. It took you a while to get in. It's going to take you a while to get out. So just get to a pace where you're like, hey, we can still go on a vacation. We might pare it down a little. We might do it a little different, but we can still do that. We can still eat out some. We can still have the kids in this or that activity. Like, it doesn't need to be this just bare to the bones, like where you're questioning if you even could hold out till the end. We don't want that kind of a thing. So pace over position, absolutely. And then prevention, definitely address the prevention before you start trying to, pay down that debt aggressively.
Yeah, I think by analogy, it's probably not all that different from if you think of someone who maybe has a lot of weight that they want to lose, right? You can only push yourself so far until you feel like I hate my life and I don't want to do this and I can't sustain this, and you kind of crash. But another part of it, a lot of it just comes down to momentum, and a lot of it comes down to being able to track the wins, which is, I think, the genius behind letting the money age, is that you're keeping the constraints and keeping this feeling of scarcity that's also tied to agency, while also being able to see clear wins that's compounding over time, which is, again, just like super empowering. And I think for virtually all things, if you have those factors in place, you want to keep going, right? Because you're just feeling very empowered and you have the systems in place to enable you to keep moving forward.
Yeah, you're walking at a pace that's doable. You see you're making progress and it feels pretty good. Like check, check, check. We can do this for a long, long time. There's a weird one, Stephen, that I should mention because I think you'll appreciate it. We have an inordinate amount of people that do YNAB for a while and then quit smoking. And we're like, we have not once written, we think you should quit smoking and save money or whatever, or even for the health benefits, But like they'll become really aware of their money, this precious resource, this scarce resource. And suddenly that nasty, terribly addictive nicotine is not as powerful as the clarity they're getting, that they're like, I'd rather use my money somewhere else. And I love that so much, that it can create that kind of cascade and agency where they're like, all right, if I can do this, I can do this. And it compounds in this beautiful, beautiful way.
I once had an individual who had me write down a number of my habits that I was doing over the course of a month. That was the first step. And then the second step, I didn't know what I was supposed to be doing here. But the second step was, okay, well, why do you do those things, right? Like, what is actually the purpose behind those things? And it was fascinating because when I went through this exercise, I realized there were some things that I was doing because maybe I just always done them, or this is what people did as I was growing up. There was other things that maybe I had started doing at one point, but no longer were really serving me. And then there were some things that I was doing, but I had actually forgotten the reason why. And so I wasn't even really aligned with the intention behind it, right?
Yeah.
Almost to the degree of like, okay, if you're going to actively choose to go and eat out because the idea is you want to go and eat out and enjoy time with your family, then just even being clear about that means you're more likely to enter into that experience wanting to enjoy your family.
Absolutely.
Because you're choosing and you're being intentional about it. And so it makes a lot of sense to me that when someone lays out their finances and becomes more clear about their finances, they can say, okay, well, what is the intention behind these things? And something like smoking, for example, it's like, okay, well, what is the intention there? It's probably not the thing that's the highest investment for that money for them, right? And maybe it served a purpose in this way or another, but juxtaposed to the other things they be saying yes to, they say no to that. And I think one of the beauties of anytime you make anything concrete, in this situation with YNAB, you're making it around money, you have to make the choice. And when you make the choice, you're really saying, like, I'm saying yes to this and I'm saying no to this. And every yes we make is always a no to something else, but it's not unless you make it clear that you actually make that choice and you get to experience not only the agency, but also that joy on the back end. I want to ask you, Jesse, something that I picked up on. I've actually picked up on it this entire time while I was talking to you, and this is the first time we've met. So I didn't know who you were, right, in terms of like your spirit for things. But it struck me very early in the conversation that this is deeply personal for you. Like I get a sense that this is not just like some endeavor, but these are the questions you're living through. These are the things you really, really care about. Why do you feel like this is so personal for you?
Man, I wish I knew that answer. Maybe I don't. When I was 16, I decided I would write down every time I spent money, and it was all cash, and it was mainly for like tacos at Jack in the Box, like just driving around like, oh, we're going to go grab some food. And I wrote it down, and then I looked at it a few months later, like I just like a sheet of paper, just, and I totaled it all up. And I remember being shocked at how much money I'd spent. And then I kept doing it. And the next month I noticed that I'd spent less. And the next month I'd spent less. So I had this weird experience as a 16-year-old kid. I don't know what else my mind was thinking, probably nothing useful. And it was like, oh, when I'm aware of it, I affect it. Even though I didn't say I'm going to spend less, the awareness steered me. And that lesson's never really left me. And so there's a bit of that. There's another bit of me that's almost like this injustice. And everyone has it for different things. And I think they're all super important, but you can't feel it for everything. You know, you'd go crazy. And mine is around people giving up so much of their life for this resource. Like a brain surgeon, just this brilliant person. And then they look me square in the face and they're like, I'm not good with money. And you're like, you have got to be kidding me. You know, you operate on brains. And I just see it as, we talked about waste at the outset. I see it as this loss for humanity to have people not intentionally allocating their precious capital to whatever endeavor lights them up. The more we can do that, I genuinely feel like the world will be a better place. And for some reason, that's the injustice I want to fight against. That's the thing that just gets me going. And so I've just tried to respect it and give it space and write about it and blather on about it. And it doesn't seem to get old for me. And so I'm just kind of continuing until someday I suddenly have this overwhelming feeling of like, you are finished, you know, move along, and I'll just grow food in my backyard at that point, you know. But until then, I'm just going to keep going. But that's the burning that I feel is around that, a precious resource generated from like precious time and attention from humans. And like, let's keep it precious as we expend it, you know?
Mm-hmm. There's so much in that resonates with me. And I think that there's a lot of similarities even in terms of with the Monk Manual. I think what drives me ultimately is potential, just like human potential. Yeah. It pains me when I think about people who maybe are not able to live into their potential and the goodness that's there, or experience the goodness of their life that could be there. And I think for me, that's translated more for time. I think for you, it sounds like that translates a lot through money. And I think that the thing is, ultimately, whether we like it or not, money is just a really large part of all of our lives. And a lot of the things that we want to bring about from a potential in our own life does go back on some level to our ability to handle money and how we relate to money. And I think that what you're doing is wonderful work in trying to help people change the way they relate to money and then have better habits. I know we have to wrap up here, but I'd like to end with some kind of like rapid fire questions.
Yeah.
If you had to go back in time 10 years ago, what advice would you give yourself?
Slow down. Yeah. And I don't know how specifically, but I would look at myself and be like, whoa, you look 10 years older, you know? And my 10 years older version would be like, hey man, slow down just a little bit. Just gear shift a little. Yeah, that's it. Kids are getting older. I have 7 kids. They're getting older. So it all boils down back to that where you're like, man, I hope I'm present, you know? So that's it.
What's something you're trying to cultivate more of right now?
It's funny. It goes back to the slowness. I'm really trying to be content with leisure. I'll call it leisure. To not feel like there's something else that needs to be done. I think there's like a lot of Puritan in me or something. I don't know. But it's like I should be out with like a sickle, you know? And I'm really trying to just sit with that and try and relax, you know? Not waste time. I didn't say waste, but like leisure. Yeah. I'm really trying to cultivate that. And it is hard for me. So I'm enjoying it. There's another bit, because I couldn't choose, so I'm going to make this bigger. This year I'm studying the word meek. And I'm just trying to think about it a lot. I love that word. In German, the translation is soft courage. And so I like that, you know, this idea of soft courage. That just seems very cool. So that has me wrapped up a little bit, you know, here and there.
If you could give people one piece of advice for how to live a more potent life, what would it be?
Oh, we got to do with the money thing. If we're talking about potent, it's like, how do you make your money more potent? When I saw the title, I was like, absolutely. Yes. You know, potency in all the right ways, you know, where it has the intended effect. We got to do it with money. Absolutely.
What's something you know for sure?
That my family loves me and I love my family.
What's something you're still trying to figure out?
How to be a dad. So thankful for the prior answer, because they're such good examples of being like, I forgive you, Dad. And you're like, hey man, I totally don't know what I'm doing, but I appreciate that you keep giving me grace, you know?
Beautiful. Well, Jesse, thank you so much for joining me. Can you just share a bit about where people can learn more about what you're doing with YNAB?
Yeah. I mean, YNAB.com, you can go there and just see all about it. We let people try it out for 34 days and just kick the tires. We don't do anything weird. You know, we don't ask for your card and then hope that you accidentally spend money with us. That would be antithetical to the entire thing. I'm not on socials, so you can email me, jesse@ynab.com, if you want to drop me a line, and I will respond. Not always super fast, but I do respond. Yeah, I think that's about it.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Jesse.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.